The 1990 Life L190. It was Italian. It had a handmade W12 engine. It once only made it 400 yards down the pit lane before the engine blew up because the mechanics didn't put any oil in it. It didn't even have a working tachometer. The Life L190 would try to qualify and enter into 14 of the 16 rounds of the 1990 Formula One season, but it was so slow that it couldn't even pre-qualify. It was so slow that Formula 3000 cars were faster than it. It was so slow that it holds the record for the slowest lap in Formula One, and it's incredible. Who doesn't love a good show? But how? How does a car like this even exist in the first place? How does a car like this even get on the grid in Formula One in the first place? A car that's 20 seconds off the pace on a hot lap? The FW43 from Williams in 2020 was only 2 seconds off the pace, and we thought that was bad. You can literally see the difference in speed of the cars going down the straight in this clip. Wait for it. Wait for it. Almost. There it is. When they showed up on the Formula One grid in 1990 with the Life L190, it was, in my opinion, one of the prettiest cars that showed up that year. It looked really good, there's no denying that, it looked great. And not only did the team share a similar paint scheme and the same birthplace as Ferrari, but Life's creator, Franco Rocci, was an ex-Ferrari engineer who was actually responsible for the engine design of the 308 GTB in the 1970s. And while he was at Ferrari, he actually would spend a lot of his time proposing a W12 power unit until he got fired in 1980. And after he got the kick from the prancing horse once and for all, he would go on to spend almost the next 10 years of his life prototyping and developing W12 engines. And it just so happens that in 1989, the FIA would go on to ban turbo engines in Formula One because they were just too costly to develop and run for the teams at the time. Not only that, but going into 1989 and the 1990s, those new engine regulations were actually pretty loose and open to interpretation. This led to a number of different configurations as well as different manufacturers, and it also gave Rocci an in for his all-new 3.5 liter W12 design. There was one problem. There is one other problem. You gotta be kidding me. Having a running engine is one thing, but to be in Formula One, you need to have a lot of money, a lot of buckaroos, a lot of euros, a lot of lira, whatever. You needed money. So in 1989, Rocci meets up with Italian businessman, our precious Ernesto Vita, a guy who knew absolutely nothing about Formula One or racing, but he had the money, and Rossi's pitch of his radical W12 design was well received by Ernesto. And for reasons unknown, Vita would decide that motorsport was a good way to make a quick buck. To capitalize on the opportunity of the 1989 engine regulations, Vita would go on to purchase the rights of the W12 from Rocci himself, hoping that he would be able to supply this new engine to one of the top teams. The trouble, of course, being, why would a top team like Ferrari or Williams or Benetton go with a new and unproven engine supplier when they can just stick with powerhouses like Ford or Honda? It was at this point that Ernesto made the very sensible decision that, well, if nobody wants to buy our engines, we'll just race them ourselves. We'll show you just how good the W12 is. Except you need more than just an engine to be able to race. You need a chassis that the team didn't have. They were just an engine supplier at this point, which is not ideal. I mean, if you want to win races, you need a car to be able to race the races with. So instead of developing their own chassis, they decided it would be better to purchase one from a company called First Racing, a team that tried to race in the 1989 season but failed to do so because the chassis wouldn't pass the FIA crash tests. Not to mention that the chassis itself was a very flawed design. However, the newly developed Life Racing team was able to sort out the safety issues with the chassis that they bought and literally cram that W12 motor into the back of it. Now they have an engine, now they have a chassis, and thus the only car that they would ever make, the Life L190, was born. Now I'm all for an underdog story, and if I was alive in 1990 and if I was watching Formula One in 1990, I'm sure I would have been a fan of the Life team and what they were trying to do. A radical engine design that's never been raced before. An ex-Ferrari employee chasing down his dream to get to the big leagues, getting a car that has no business being in Formula One into Formula One. I love it! Also, I'm pretty sure that if I was watching in 1990, that love would have faded pretty quickly. Come the season opener in 1990 in Phoenix, Arizona. At this point, there's 35 different cars on the grid from 19 different teams, a little bit different from how it is right now. And due to safety concerns, sensibly, you could only allow up to 26 cars to actually race on Sunday. So what do? Well, this meant that cars actually had to qualify for the race. Trouble is that 36 cars is still way too much for even qualifying, so they had to introduce a pre-qualifying on Friday. And the Friday sessions were only mandatory for new teams as well as the worst performing 2 teams from the year before. So you had pre-qualifying and then the actual qualifying and then the race. Glad we're all on the same page. So it's the season opener and Gary Brabham, son of F1 champion Jack Brabham, is about to take his all-new radically designed car out for the first official session. Life's target to make it out of pre-qualifying is a lap time of 1 minute and 33 seconds. The lap time they set was 2 minutes and 7 seconds. A 34-second gap compared to where they needed to be able to qualify on Saturday.
Gary Brabham with the Life with that strange W12 engine. That car didn't go at all well. He only did 4 laps, and Gary didn't even get under 2 minutes.
I almost feel bad. I'm just gonna quickly list off some of the problems that this car had. It had terrible fuel mapping, which led to very inconsistent throttle behavior. Had a terrible build quality, which meant that it was really scary to drive at all. It ran very, very hot and wore very, very quickly. It was reported to oversteer when turning left and understeer when turning right. And that revolutionary W12? Yeah. It wasn't good. It might have sounded good, but it wasn't good. Now, during this era of Formula One, the cars like the Benettons and the Ferraris were able to put out around 700 horses to the wheels on any given day. 700. But the Life's W12, despite being a lot bigger, a lot heavier, a lot more complex, a lot more unreliable, could barely put out 400 on a good day. And even when it was making that 400 on a good day, the mapping required to do so would mean that it would have to be rebuilt after a lap or 2, maybe. So if the team wanted to be able to run reliably, which they also couldn't do, but if they wanted to, they would have to run closer to 350, maybe 360. Almost half of the power of the people that you're racing against. At the third race of the season at the San Marino Grand Prix, the Life would rank last and of course fail to make it out of pre-quali. That's a given. But at that same race, do you want to know what time pole sitter Ayrton Senna sets? A lap time of 1 minute and 23 seconds. 1 minute and 23 seconds. You know what time the Life set at that same circuit on that same day? 7 minutes and 16 seconds. 7 minutes and 16 seconds. Bro. Now, I think it's safe to say that the W12 wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders, literally, at the time that this lap time was recorded, but it was an official session, and it was never running on all cylinders, so... Woo! Oh boy. This was at Imola. The Life's average speed was 35 kilometers per hour. Usain Bolt could have beat this car around the track. But despite the L190 being the heaviest car with the slowest engine, the owner and team boss Ernesto Vida never lacked perseverance. The team would continue its attempts to pre-qualify all throughout the 1990 season without any success. If anything, the situation would only get worse as other teams continued to improve. At the British Grand Prix in 1990, the Life's best performance, the car would fail to qualify by a massive 19 seconds. And that was their best performance of the entire season. That's the closest they ever got to qualifying. And at Hockenheim's power-intensive circuits, the speed trap showed the car lapping more than 40 miles an hour slower than the second slowest car on the straights. 25% slower than everyone else. Now, aware that it had the worst engine and car on the grid, Vito would eventually ditch Racci's radical W12 design late in the season in favor of a more conventional but still underpowered Judd V8. And at the 14th round of the season in Portugal, the team had hoped for a step forward with its new engine. Except that the engine didn't even fit in the car. They couldn't get it to fit in the chassis that they had modified to originally be able to fit the W12. When it left the pits, the engine cover would blow off like Max Verstappen at Monza. But unlike Toro Rosso, they wouldn't even put it back on. They just finished the session without it. And not surprisingly, they would yet again fail to pre-qualify for the race before finally withdrawing officially at the Spanish Grand Prix and calling the project quits. This is a team that didn't even have a tire pressure gauge. They had to borrow one from other teams. All of this would seal the fate of the Life L190 as, objectively, the worst Formula One car of all time. And honestly, one of the worst race cars of all time.